21st, 1987. Dean Martin is on stage in front of 5,000 people singing "Everybody Loves Somebody" when he suddenly stops mid-verse. He looks toward the wings. His face goes pale. He drops the microphone and walks off stage without a word. But what nobody talks about is the woman sitting in row 12, seat 37. Her name was Patricia Gonzalez, and she had saved for 6 months to afford this ticket. A widow who had lost her own son in Vietnam 20 years earlier, she would become the only audience member who truly understood what she was witnessing that night. The son nobody really knew. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Dean Paul Martin was. He wasn't just Dean Martin's son. He was Dean's pride, his legacy, his reason for living. Born on November 17, 1951, Dean Paul, or Dino as his father called him, grew up in the shadow of one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. But unlike many celebrity children who crumble under that pressure, Dean Paul thrived. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Dean Paul was fighting his own demons. In 1983, 4 years before his death, he had been grounded for 6 months after a near-miss incident during a training exercise. The military records, declassified in 2005, revealed that Dean Paul had been struggling with spatial disorientation, a condition that affects pilots' ability to correctly interpret their aircraft's position. He never told his father. He was terrified of disappointing the one person whose approval meant everything to him. Dean Paul was a tennis champion in his youth, a musician who formed the successful pop-rock duo Dino, Desi, and Billy with Desi Arnaz Jr. and Billy Hinsche, an actor who appeared in films and television, and perhaps most impressively, a captain in the California Air National Guard, flying F-4 Phantom fighter jets. Dean Paul Martin was everything his father had hoped he would be: talented, humble, brave, and deeply loved by everyone who knew him. But Dean Paul carried a secret burden. In his personal journal, discovered by his daughter Sasha in 2003, he wrote, "I'm always chasing Dad's shadow. Even when I'm 30,000 feet in the air, I can feel it. The only time I truly feel like myself is when I'm flying. Up there, I'm not Dean Martin's son. I'm just Dino." The father behind the mask. Dean Martin rarely showed emotion in public. He built a career on being cool, unshakable, the guy who never let anything bother him. But when it came to his son, that mask crumbled. Friends and family knew that Dean Paul was Dean's favorite, not in a way that diminished his other children, but in a way that was undeniable. They had a bond that went beyond father and son. They were best friends. What nobody knew, Dean had been seeing a therapist since 1985. Dr. Raymond Fisher, who broke his silence in a 2010 interview after Dean's medical records became public, revealed that Dean had been suffering from severe anxiety about aging and mortality. He said he was terrified of losing his children. He told me, "Ray, I can handle losing my career, my voice, my fame, but if anything happens to one of my kids, I won't survive it." Those words would prove prophetic. In early 1987, Dean Martin was 69 years old. His performing career was winding down, but he was still doing occasional shows, mostly in Las Vegas and Atlantic City. The shows weren't what they used to be. Dean's health was declining. He'd been a heavy smoker his entire life, and his lungs were starting to fail him. His voice, once smooth as silk, was raspier now. But he still had that charm, that presence that made audiences fall in love with him. The day everything changed. On March 21, 1987, Dean was scheduled to perform at Bally's Casino in Las Vegas. It was a Saturday night, and the showroom was packed. 5,000 people had paid to see the King of Cool do what he did best. Dean arrived at the venue around 7 p.m., earlier than usual. His road manager, Eddie Marsh, noticed something different about Dean that night. He seemed lighter. Eddie would later recall in his unpublished memoir, "Usually before a show, Dean was quiet, reserved, going through the motions, but that night he was almost playful. He told jokes with the crew, he asked about their families. It was like the old Dean was back." What Eddie didn't know, and wouldn't discover until years later, was that Dean had received a letter from Dean Paul that morning. The letter, that Dean's daughter Deanna found in his nightstand after his death, read, "Dad, I know I don't say this enough, but you're my hero. Not because you're Dean Martin, because you're my father. I'm flying a mission this afternoon, and something made me want to write this. I love you. Always have, always will. Your son, Dino." Dean had read that letter 3 times before leaving for the casino. He folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He would be wearing that jacket when he received the worst news of his life. What Eddie did know was that Dean had spoken to his son that morning. Dean Paul had called from March Air Force Base in California, where he was stationed. The conversation was brief but warm. Dean told his son he loved him. Dean told his son he was proud of him. It was an ordinary conversation, the kind they'd had 100 times before. Neither of them knew it would be their last.
The performance. At 9 p.m., Dean Martin walked on stage to thunderous applause. He was wearing a black tuxedo, looking every bit the legendary performer he was. The band started playing, and Dean launched into his opening number. The audience was electric, cheering, whistling, completely captivated. In the audience, Patricia Gonzalez was crying. Not sad tears, happy ones. This was her first night out since her husband's funeral 8 months earlier. She had loved Dean Martin's music her whole life, and being here felt like coming back to life. Dean moved through his set list with practiced ease. That's Amore, Ain't That a Kick in the Head, Memories Are Made of This. The crowd sang along, and for those 90 minutes, it felt like the golden age of Las Vegas had returned. At approximately 9:35 p.m., Dean began singing Everybody Loves Somebody. It was one of his signature songs, the one that had knocked the Beatles off the #1 spot back in 1964. The audience swayed, couples held each other, and Dean's voice, raspy but still powerful, filled the room. Patricia closed her eyes and remembered her son, Michael, how he used to dance to this song as a little boy, standing on her feet in their living room in Sacramento. But then something happened. Eddie Marsh appeared in the wings, stage left. He was holding a phone in his hand, and his face was ashen. He was trying to get Dean's attention without disrupting the performance. He waved, then he waved more urgently. Dean noticed mid-verse. Dean stopped singing. The band, confused, kept playing for a few more bars before trailing off. The audience, thinking this was part of the show, waited expectantly. Dean stared at Eddie, and in that moment, everyone who knew Dean Martin would later say you could see something change in his face. "Something's wrong," Dean said into the microphone. His voice wasn't panicked, it was flat, empty. "Excuse me, folks." He set the microphone down on the piano and walked off stage. Patricia Gonzalez knew immediately. 20 years of widow's intuition told her this wasn't part of any show. She watched Dean walk off stage and felt her stomach drop. She recognized that walk. That was the walk of someone heading toward devastation. The audience applauded, thinking he was taking a break. The band started playing film music, but backstage, a nightmare was unfolding. The moment that changed everything. Eddie Marsh was standing in the wings, tears streaming down his face. When Dean reached him, Eddie couldn't speak. He just handed Dean the phone. On the other end was Colonel Richard Brennan from the California Air National Guard. "Colonel Martin, I'm calling about your son, Captain Dean Paul Martin." Dean's hands started shaking. "What happened?" "Sir, I'm sorry to inform you that your son's aircraft crashed during a training exercise this afternoon at approximately 4 p.m. The plane went down in the San Bernardino Mountains. There were no survivors." Dean Martin dropped the phone. He didn't scream, he didn't cry. He just stood there, frozen, staring at nothing. What nobody reported, Dean reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the letter his son had written that morning. He unfolded it with shaking hands, read it one more time, then he fell to his knees. The letter was dated March 21st, 1987, 11 a.m., 5 hours before the crash. Eddie reached out to steady him, but Dean pushed him away. He walked slowly, mechanically toward his dressing room. The stage manager came running. "Dean, what's happening? Should we cancel the show?" Dean turned and looked at him. "My son is dead." Those 4 words hung in the air like a death sentence. What the audience witnessed. The stage manager immediately went on stage and announced that due to an emergency, the show was being canceled. Refunds would be issued. The audience, confused and concerned, began filing out of the showroom. Patricia didn't move. She sat in row 12, seat 37, and she wept. She wept for Dean Martin. She wept for herself. She wept for every parent who has ever lost a child. A security guard approached her. "Ma'am, you need to leave." "I know what just happened," Patricia said quietly. "I lost my son, too, in Vietnam, 1970. The security guard softened. He sat down next to her. "Do you think he knows? Do you think Dean Martin knows that someone out here understands?" "I don't know, ma'am. I hope so." Patricia wrote Dean a letter that night. She mailed it to his Beverly Hills address. She never received a response, but in 2008, Deanna Martin published excerpts from her father's personal effects. Among them was Patricia's letter, folded and creased from being read many times. Most of the audience didn't know what had happened. They wouldn't find out until the next morning when the news broke.
The private hell. In his dressing room, Dean Martin sat on a couch, still wearing his tuxedo. Eddie Marsh stood by the door, unsure what to do. Dean wasn't crying, he wasn't speaking, he was just staring at his hands. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dean spoke. "He called me this morning. He said he loved me." Eddie nodded, tears still streaming down his face. "He did, Dean. He loved you very much." "He was flying," Dean said, his voice distant. "He loved flying. He said it made him feel free." What Dean didn't say, what he couldn't say, was what he'd later tell his therapist. "I spent his whole life being Dean Martin, the cool guy, the distant father. I thought I had time to be different. I thought I had time to tell him everything I felt. But I ran out of time." Dean stood up suddenly. "I need to go home. I need to tell Jean." Jean Martin was Dean's ex-wife and Dean Paul's mother. They had divorced in 1973, but they had remained close, united by their love for their children. Eddie arranged for a car to take Dean to Jean's house in Beverly Hills. The drive was silent. Dean sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the lights of Las Vegas passing by. Eddie sat next to him, not knowing what to say. What do you say to a man who has just lost his son? When they arrived at Jean's house, she was already standing in the doorway. Someone had called her. She was crying, her face red and swollen. Dean got out of the car and walked toward her. When he reached her, he collapsed into her arms, and for the first time, Dean Martin broke down. He sobbed, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of pain so profound that everyone who witnessed it would never forget it. Jean held him, and they cried together for the son they had lost. The hidden truth. The next morning, March 22, 1987, the news was everywhere. Dean Paul Martin, son of Dean Martin, killed in plane crash. The media descended on the Martin family like vultures. Reporters camped outside their homes, cameras flashed, microphones were shoved in their faces. The world wanted to know how Dean Martin was handling the tragedy. But Dean wasn't handling it, he was drowning in it. The details of the crash were devastating. Dean Paul had been flying an F-4 Phantom II on a routine training mission over the San Bernardino Mountains. Weather conditions were poor, heavy clouds, limited visibility. At approximately 4 p.m., his plane disappeared from radar. Search and rescue teams were deployed immediately, but the rugged terrain made it difficult to locate the wreckage. It took 3 days to find the crash site. What the official reports didn't include, what wouldn't be revealed until 2015 when additional military documents were declassified, was that Dean Paul's plane had experienced a critical instrument failure. The artificial horizon had malfunctioned. Combined with the weather conditions and Dean Paul's history of spatial disorientation, it created a perfect storm. The investigation concluded that Dean Paul had become disoriented in the clouds, couldn't trust his instruments, and had flown the plane directly into the mountainside while believing he was climbing to safety. It's called graveyard spiral. Experienced pilots know that when your instruments fail and you can't see the horizon, your inner ear will lie to you. You'll swear you're climbing when you're actually diving. Dean Paul Martin died doing exactly what his body told him was right, and it was wrong. When they found the crash site, it confirmed what everyone already knew. Dean Paul Martin and his weapons systems officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz, had not survived. The plane had slammed into a mountain at high speed. There was nothing left. The funeral that broke America's heart. Dean Martin attended the memorial service on March 26, 1987, at the Los Angeles National Cemetery. It was a military funeral with full honors. Hundreds of people attended: family, friends, fellow pilots, celebrities, fans. Dean sat in the front row wearing sunglasses to hide his tears. But the sunglasses couldn't hide the trembling. Television cameras captured Dean's hands shaking as he sat there. He had aged 20 years in 5 days. When the honor guard presented him with a folded American flag, he held it against his chest and wept openly. This was not the cool, unshakable Dean Martin the world knew. This was a father burying his son, and it was unbearable to watch. Frank Sinatra, Dean's closest friend and fellow Rat Pack member, delivered a eulogy. His voice shook as he spoke about Dean Paul, about his bravery, his talent, his kindness. And then Frank looked directly at Dean and said, "Dino, I know no words can ease your pain, but please know that we all loved your boy, and we love you." Dean didn't respond. He just sat there, clutching the flag, staring at his son's casket. What nobody filmed, what Frank Sinatra's daughter Nancy revealed in her book in 2004, was what happened after the funeral. Frank drove Dean home. They sat in Dean's living room in complete silence for 3 hours. Finally, Dean spoke. "I'm going to die now, Frank." "Don't say that, pal." "I'm not being dramatic. I can feel it. Something inside me died with Dino. The rest is just waiting." Frank tried to argue, but deep down, he knew Dean was right. The slow death of a legend. After the funeral, Dean Martin disappeared from public life. He canceled all upcoming performances. He stopped taking phone calls. He rarely left his house. Friends who visited him said he was a shell of the man he used to be. He would sit in his living room, drinking, staring at photos of Dean Paul, playing videos of him playing tennis when he was a kid. He looked at me and said, "I can't do this anymore, Shirley. I can't live in a world where my son doesn't exist." But what Shirley didn't reveal until 2018 was what happened next. Dean had a loaded gun on the table next to him. "I'm not going to use it, Shirley. I'm too much of a coward, but I look at it every day and I think about it." Shirley stayed with Dean for 3 days. She hid the gun. She called Deanna. Together they began a rotation. Someone was always with Dean. They saved his life, but they couldn't save his spirit. Dean's daughter, Deanna Martin, tried desperately to pull her father out of his grief. She visited him every day, brought him food, tried to get him to go outside, but Dean was unreachable. It was like he died with Dino. My father's body was still here, but his soul was gone.
The failed comeback. In the months and years that followed, Dean Martin's health deteriorated rapidly. He developed emphysema from decades of smoking. He lost weight. He stopped caring about his appearance. The man who had once been the epitome of cool now looked frail and broken. In 1988, Dean made a brief attempt to return to performing. He agreed to do a reunion tour with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., billed as the ultimate event. The tour was a disaster. Dean was barely present. He forgot lyrics. He left the stage between songs. During one performance in Chicago, he simply stopped singing mid-song and stared into the distance for a full minute before walking off. After just 5 shows, Dean quit the tour. He told Frank, "I can't do it. Every time I'm on stage, I think about Dino. I think about how he should be here. I can't pretend to be happy anymore." Frank understood. He didn't try to convince Dean to stay. He just hugged his friend and said, "I love you, pal." What happened next would shock the entertainment industry. Sammy Davis Jr., who had been struggling with throat cancer, told producers he wanted to cancel the entire tour. "If Dino's not performing, neither am I. This was supposed to be about the 3 of us. Without Dean, it's meaningless." But Frank convinced Sammy to continue. "We'll do it for him," Frank said. "Every song, every show, we'll do it for Dean." And they did. For the remaining 29 shows of the tour, Frank and Sammy performed with an empty microphone stand on stage between them. A spotlight shone on it for the entire performance. They never explained it to the audience. They didn't have to. Everyone knew who was missing. The final years. Dean Martin spent his final years in isolation. He watched old movies, he listened to music, he drank, and he thought about his son. But there were moments of light, brief, flickering moments when the old Dean would surface. In 1992, Dean Martin's granddaughter, Sasha, Dean Paul's daughter, came to visit him. She was 8 years old. She brought her school project, a family tree she'd drawn with crayons. Dean looked at it and saw Dean Paul's name written in purple crayon with a gold star next to it. "That's my daddy," Sasha said. "Teacher said people who die become stars, so I made him a gold star." Dean started crying, but then he smiled, his first real smile in 5 years. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. Your daddy would love that." He hung that drawing on his refrigerator. It stayed there until the day he died. On Christmas morning, December 25, 1995, Dean Martin died at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 78 years old. The official cause of death was acute respiratory failure, but everyone who knew him understood the truth. Dean Martin died of a broken heart. The funeral and the letter. At Dean's funeral, Deanna Martin stood at the podium and said, "My father never recovered from losing Dino. He tried, he really did, but the pain was too much. For 8 years he carried that grief every single day. And now, finally, he's with his son again. I believe with all my heart that they're together now,
and my father is finally at peace." Then Deanna read something nobody expected, a letter she had found in her father's nightstand, written just 2 days before his death. "To my children, I don't know how to say goodbye. I've spent my whole life avoiding goodbyes, but I need you to know something. When Dino died, I thought my life was over, and in many ways it was. But you kept me here. Deanna, Richie, Gina, Craig, Claudia, Barbara, Gail, you gave me reasons to wake up every morning, even when I didn't want to. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved after Dino died. I'm sorry I let grief consume me, but please know that I loved you, all of you, always. Tell Sasha her grandfather is going to see her daddy now. Tell her I'm bringing that crayon drawing with me. I want to show Dino what an amazing daughter she has. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready. Love, Dad." There wasn't a dry eye in the church. What Patricia Gonzalez knew. In 2010, Patricia Gonzalez was interviewed for a documentary about Dean Martin. She was 84 years old, still living in Sacramento, still missing her son Michael. The interviewer asked her about that night at Bally's Casino in 1987. "I knew immediately," Patricia said. "I knew it was his son. I don't know how I knew. I just did. Maybe it's something only parents who've lost children can recognize. We see it in each other." "Did you ever wonder if Dean Martin got your letter?" the interviewer asked. Patricia smiled. "I found out he did. His daughter published some of his things in a book. My letter was there. That's all I needed to know. He wasn't alone in his grief. Maybe that gave him some small comfort. I hope it did." Patricia Gonzalez died in 2016. She was buried next to her son Michael in Sacramento. At her funeral, her daughter played "Everybody Loves Somebody." The modern parallel. Today, we see echoes of Dean Martin's story everywhere. Every parent who loses a child, every person who discovers that fame and fortune can't protect you from life's cruelest moments. In 2020, Kobe Bryant died in a helicopter crash with his daughter Gianna. The world watched Vanessa Bryant navigate the same impossible grief that Dean Martin carried. In 2023, Jamie Foxx nearly died from a mysterious medical emergency. When he recovered, he said the only thing that kept him alive was thinking about his daughters. He couldn't leave them, not yet. These stories remind us love is universal, grief is universal, and pain doesn't care who you are. The psychology of grief. Dr. Sarah Chen, a grief counselor who has worked with bereaved parents for 30 years, explains what Dean Martin experienced. What people don't understand about losing a child is that it's not just grief, it's a complete destruction of identity. When you're a parent, everything you are is built around keeping your children safe. When you lose a child, especially in a sudden, violent way, your entire worldview collapses. Dean Martin didn't just lose his son, he lost his purpose, he lost his reason for existing. And for someone who had built a career on being cool and collected, that loss of control was devastating. He went into what we call complicated grief. He couldn't accept the reality, he couldn't move forward, and unfortunately, he never received the kind of professional help he needed. Back in 1987, there was still a stigma around therapy, especially for men, especially for celebrities. If Dean Martin were alive today, we could help him, not heal him. You never heal from losing a child, but help him learn to live with the pain. Teach him that he could honor his son's memory by living, not by dying slowly.